This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 13. Tea and Tennis. "Met the professor's late boatman on the Cobb," said Mr. Chase, dissecting a chocolate cake. "Clumsy man," said Phyllis. "I hope he was ashamed of himself. I shall never forgive him for trying to drown Papa." My heart bled for Mr. Henry Hawke, that modern martyr. "When I met him," said Tom Chase, "he looked as if he had been trying to drown his sorrow as well." "I knew he drank," said Phyllis severely, "the very first time I saw him." "You might have warned the professor," murmured Mr. Chase. "He couldn't have upset the boat if he had been sober." "You never know. He may have done it on purpose." "Tom, how absurd." "Rather rough on the man, aren't you?" I said. "Merely a suggestion," continued Mr. Chase airily. "I've been reading sensational novels lately, and it seems to me that Mr. Hawke's cut out to be a minion. Probably some secret foe of the professor's bribed him." My heart stood still. Did he know, I wondered, and was this all a roundabout way of telling me he knew? "The professor may be a member of an anarchist league or something, and this is punishment for refusing to assassinate some sportsman." "Have another cup of tea, Tom, and stop talking nonsense." Mr. Chase handed in his cup. "What gave me the idea that the upset was done on purpose was this. I saw the whole thing from the Wear Cliff. The spill looked to me just like dozens I had seen at Malta." "Why do they upset themselves on purpose at Malta particularly?" inquired Phyllis. "Listen carefully, my dear, and you'll know more about the ways of the Navy that guards your coast than you did before. When men are allowed on shore at Malta, the owner has a fancy to see them snugly on board again at a certain reasonable hour. After that hour, any Maltese policeman who brings them aboard gets 1 sovereign, cash. But he has to do all the bringing part of it on his own. Consequence is, you see, boats rowing out to the ship carrying men who have overstayed their leave. And when they get near enough, the able-bodied gentleman in custody jumps to his feet, upsets the boat, and swims for the gangway. The policemen, if they aren't drowned, they sometimes are, race him, and whichever gets there first wins. If it's the policeman, he gets his sovereign. If it's the sailor, he is considered to have arrived not in a state of custody and gets off easier. What a judicious remark that was of the governor of North Carolina to the governor of South Carolina respecting the length of time between drinks. Just one more cup, please, Phyllis." "But how does all that apply?" I asked, dry-mouthed. "Mr. Hawke upset the professor just as those Maltese were upset. There's a patent way of doing it. Furthermore, by judicious questioning, I found that Hawke was once in the Navy and stationed at Malta. Now, who's going to drag in Sherlock Holmes?" "You don't really think," I said, feeling like a criminal in the dock when the case is going against him. "I think friend Hawke has been reenacting the joys of his vanished youth, so to speak." "He ought to be prosecuted," said Phyllis, blazing with indignation. "Alas, poor Hawke." "Nobody's safe with a man of that sort hiring out a boat." "Oh, miserable Hawke." "But why on earth should he play a trick like that on Professor Derrick, Chase?" "Pure animal spirits, probably. Or he may, as I say, be a minion." I was hot all over. "I shall tell Father that," said Phyllis in her most decided voice, "and see what he says. I don't wonder at the man taking to drink after doing such a thing." I think you're making a mistake," I said. "I never make mistakes," Mr. Chase replied. "I am called Archibald the All-Right, for I am infallible. I propose to keep a reflective eye upon the jovial Hawke." He helped himself to another section of the chocolate cake. "Haven't you finished yet, Tom?" inquired Phyllis. "I'm sure Mr. Garnet's getting tired of sitting talking here," she said. I shot out a polite negative. Mr. Chase explained with his mouth full that he had by no means finished. Chocolate cake, it appeared, was the dream of his life. When at sea, he was accustomed to lie awake o' nights thinking of it. "You don't seem to realize," he said, "that I have just come from a cruise on a torpedo boat. There was such a sea on as a rule that cooking operations were entirely suspended, and we lived on ham and sardines, without bread." "How horrible!" "On the other hand," added Mr. Chase philosophically, "it didn't matter much, because we were all ill most of the time." "Don't be nasty, Tom." "I was merely defending myself. I hope Mr. Hawk will be able to do as well when his turn comes. My aim, my dear Phyllis, is to show you in a series of impressionist pictures the sort of thing I have to go through when I'm not here. Then perhaps you won't rend me so savagely over a matter of 5 minutes' lateness for breakfast." 5 minutes? It was 3/4 of an hour, and everything was simply frozen. "Quite right, too, in weather like this. You're a slave to convention, Phyllis. You think breakfast ought to be hot, so you always have it hot. On occasion I prefer mine cold. Mine is the truer wisdom. You can give the cook my compliments, Phyllis, and tell her, gently, for I don't wish the glad news to overwhelm her, that I enjoyed the cake. Say that I shall be glad to hear from her again. Care for a game of tennis, Garnet?" "What a pity Nora isn't here," said Phyllis. "We could have had a 4. "But she is at present wasting her sweetness on the desert air of Yeovil. You had better sit down and watch us, Phyllis. Tennis in this sort of weather is no job for the delicately nurtured feminine. I will explain the finer points of my game as we go on. Look out particularly for the Tilden backhanded slosh, a winner every time." We proceeded to the tennis court. I played with the sun in my eyes. I might, if I chose, emphasize that fact and attribute my subsequent rout to it, adding, by way of solidifying the excuse, that I was playing on a strange court with a borrowed racket, and that my mind was preoccupied, firstly with l'affaire Hawk, secondly, and chiefly, with the gloomily thought that Phyllis and my opponent seemed to be on friendly terms with each other. Their manner at tea had been almost that of an engaged couple. There was a thorough understanding between them. I will not, however, take refuge behind excuses. I admit, without qualifying the statement, that Mr. Chase was too good for me. I had always been under the impression that lieutenants in the Royal Navy were not brilliant at tennis. I had met them at various houses, and they had never shone conspicuously. They had played an earnest, unobtrusive game, and generally seemed glad when it was over. Mr. Chase was not of this sort. His service was bottled lightning. His returns behaved like jumping crackers. He won the first game in precisely 6 strokes. He served. Only once did I take the service with the full face of the racket, and then I seemed to be stopping a bullet. I returned it into the net. The last of the series struck the wooden edge of my racket and soared over the back net into the shrubbery, after the manner of a snick to long slip off a fast bowler. "Game," said Mr. Chase. "We'll look for that afterwards." I felt a worm and no man. Phyllis, I thought, would probably judge my entire character from this exhibition. A man, she would reflect, who could be so feeble and miserable a failure at tennis could not be good for much in any department of life. She would compare me instinctively with my opponent, and contrast his dash and brilliance with my own inefficiency. Somehow the massacre was beginning to have a bad effect on my character. All my self-respect was ebbing. A little more of this, and I should become crushed, a mere human jelly. It was my turn to serve. Service is my strong point at tennis. I am inaccurate but vigorous, and occasionally send in a quite unplayable shot. One or two of these, even at the expense of a fault or so, and I might be permitted to retain at least a portion of my self-respect. I opened with a couple of faults. The sight of Phyllis, sitting calm and cool in her chair under the cedar, unnerved me. I served another fault, and yet another. "Here, I say, Garnet," observed Mr. Chase plaintively. "Do put me out of this hideous suspense. I'm becoming a mere bundle of quivering ganglions." I loathe facetiousness in moments of stress. I frowned austerely, made no reply, and served another fault, my fifth. Matters had reached a crisis. Even if I had to lob it underhand, I must send the ball over the net with the next stroke. I restrained myself this time, eschewing the careless vigor which had marked my previous efforts. The ball flew in a slow semicircle and pitched inside the correct court. At least, I told myself, I had not served a fault. What happened then I cannot exactly say. I saw my opponent spring forward like a panther and whirl his racket. The next moment the back net was shaking violently, and the ball was rolling swiftly along the ground on a return journey to the other court. "Love 40, said Mr. Chase. "Phyllis." "Yes." "That was the Tilden slosh." "I thought it must be," said Phyllis. In the third game I managed to score 15. By the merest chance I returned one of his red-hot serves, and, probably through surprise, he failed to send it back again. In the fourth and fifth games I omitted to score. Phyllis had left the cedar now, and was picking flowers from the beds behind the court. We began the sixth game, and now, for some reason, I played really well. I struck a little vein of brilliance. I was serving, and this time a proportion of my serves went over the net instead of trying to get through. The score went from 15 all to 40-15. Hope began to surge through my veins. If I could keep this up, I might win yet. The Tilden slosh diminished my lead by 15. Then I got in a really fine serve, which beat him. Vantage in, another slosh. Deuce, another slam. Vantage out. It was an awesome moment. There was a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken by the flood, I served. Fault. I served again. A beauty. He returned it like a flash into the corner of the court. With a supreme effort I got to it. We rallied. I was playing like a professor. Then whiz! The slosh had beaten me on the post. "Game and," said Mr. Chase, tossing his racket into the air and catching it by the handle. "Good game, that last one." I turned to see what Phyllis thought of it. At the 11th hour I had shown her of what stuff I was made. She had disappeared. "Looking for Miss Derrick?" said Chase, jumping the net and joining me in my court. "She's gone into the house." "When did she go?" "At the end of the fifth game," said Chase. "Gone to dress for dinner, I suppose," he continued. "It must be getting late. I think I ought to be going too, if you don't mind. The professor gets a little restive if I keep him waiting for his daily bread. Great Scott! That watch can't be right. What do you make of it?" "Yes, so do I. I really think I must run. You won't mind. Good night, then. See you tomorrow, I hope." I walked slowly out across the fields. That same star, in which I had confided on a former occasion, was at its post. It looked placid and cheerful. It never got beaten by 6 games to love under the very eyes of a lady star. It was never cut out ignominiously by infernally capable lieutenants in His Majesty's Navy. No wonder it was cheerful. End of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 14. A Council of War. "The fact is," said Ukridge, "if things go on as they are now, my lad, we shall be in the cart. This business wants bucking up. We don't seem to be making any headway. Why it is, I don't know, but we are not making headway. Of course, what we want is time. If only these scoundrels of tradesmen would leave us alone for a spell, we could get things going properly. But we're hampered and rattled and worried all the time, aren't we, Milly?" "Yes, dear." "You don't let me see the financial side of the thing enough," I complained. "Why don't you keep me thoroughly posted? I didn't know we were in such a bad way. The fowls look fit enough, and Edwin hasn't had one for a week." "Edwin knows as well as possible when he's done wrong, Mr. Garnet," said Mrs. Ukridge. "He was so sorry after he had killed those other two." "Yes," said Ukridge, "I saw to that." "As far as I can see," I continued, "we are going strong. Chicken for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a shade monotonous, perhaps, but look at the business we're doing. We sold a whole heap of eggs last week." "But not enough, Garney, old man. We aren't making our presence felt. England isn't ringing with our name. We sell a dozen eggs where we ought to be selling them by the 100, carting them off in trucks for the London market and congesting the traffic. Harrods and Whiteleys and the rest of them are beginning to get on their hind legs and talk. That's what they're doing. Devilish unpleasant they're making themselves. You see, laddie, there's no denying it. We did touch them for the deuce of a lot of things on account, and they agreed to take it out in eggs. All they've done so far is to take it out in apologetic letters from Milly. Now, I don't suppose there's a woman alive who can write a better apologetic letter than her nibs, but if you're broad-minded and can face facts, you can't help seeing that the juiciest apologetic letter is not an egg. I meant to say, look at it from their point of view. Harrod, or Whiteley, comes into his store in the morning, rubbing his hands expectantly. 'Well,' he says, 'how many eggs from Combe Regis today?' And instead of leading him off to a corner piled up with bursting crates, they show him a 4-page letter telling him it'll all come right in the future. I've never run a store myself, but I should think that would jar a chap. Anyhow, the blighters seem to be getting tired of waiting." "The last letter from Harrod's was quite pathetic," said Mrs. Ukridge sadly. I had a vision of an eggless London. I seemed to see homes rendered desolate, and lives embittered by the slump, and millionaires bidding against one another for the few rare specimens which Ukridge had actually managed to dispatch to Brompton and Bayswater. Ukridge, having induced himself to be broad-minded for 5 minutes, now began to slip back to his own personal point of view and became once more the man with a grievance. His fleeting sympathy with the wrongs of Mr. Harrod and Mr. Whiteley disappeared. "What it all amounts to," he said complainingly, "is that they're infernally unreasonable. I've done everything possible to meet them. Nothing could have been more manly and straightforward than my attitude. I told them in my last letter but 3 that I proposed to let them have the eggs on the Times installment system, and they said I was frivolous. They said that to send 13 eggs as payment for goods supplied to the value of £25 1 shilling 8½d was mere trifling. Trifling, I'll trouble you. That's the spirit in which they meet my suggestions. It was Harrod who did that. I've never met Harrod personally, but I'd like to, just to ask him if that's his idea of cementing amiable business relations. He knows just as well as anyone else that without credit commerce has no elasticity. It's an elementary rule. I'll bet he'd have been sick if chappies had refused to let him have tick when he was starting his store. Do you suppose Herod, when he started in business, paid cash down on the nail for everything? Not a bit of it. He went about taking people by the coat button and asking them to be good chaps and wait till Wednesday week. Trifling! Why, those 13 eggs were absolutely all we had over after Mrs. Beale had taken what she wanted for the kitchen. As a matter of fact, if it's anybody's fault, it's Mrs. Beale's. That woman literally eats eggs. The habit is not confined to her, I said. Well, what I mean to say is, she seems to bathe in them. She says she needs so many for puddings, dear, said Mrs. Ukridge. I spoke to her about it yesterday, and, of course, we often have omelettes. She can't make omelettes without breaking eggs, I urged. She can't make them without breaking us, damn it, said Ukridge. 1 or 2 more omelettes, and we're done for. No fortune on earth could stand it. We mustn't have any more omelettes, Milly. We must economize. Millions of people get on all right without omelettes. I suppose there are families where if you suddenly produce an omelette, the whole strength of the company would get up and cheer, led by father. Cancel the omelettes, old girl, from now onward. Yes, dear, but— Well? I don't think Mrs. Beale would like that very much, dear. She has been complaining a good deal about chicken at every meal. She says that the omelettes are the only things that give her a chance. She says there are always possibilities in an omelette. In short, I said, what you propose to do is deliberately to remove from this excellent lady's life the one remaining element of poetry. You mustn't do it. Give Mrs. Beale her omelettes, and let's hope for a larger supply of eggs. Another thing, said Ukridge. It isn't only that there's a shortage of eggs. That wouldn't matter so much if only we kept hatching our fresh squads of chickens. I'm not saying the hens aren't doing their best. I take off my hat to the hens. As nice a hard-working lot as I ever want to meet, full of vigor and earnestness. It's that damned incubator that's letting us down all the time. The rotten thing won't work. I don't know what's the matter with it. The long and the short of it is, it simply declines to incubate. Perhaps it's your dodge of letting down the temperature. You remember, you were telling me? I forget the details. My dear old boy, he said earnestly, there's nothing wrong with my figures. It's a mathematical certainty. What's the good of mathematics if not to help you work out that sort of thing? No, there's something deuced wrong with the machine itself, and I shall probably make a complaint to the people I got it from. Where did we get the incubator, old girl? Harrod's, I think, dear. Yes, it was Harrod's. It came down with the first lot of things. Then, said Ukridge, banging the table with his fist while his glasses flashed triumph, we've got 'em. The Lord has delivered Harrod's into our hand. Write and answer that letter of theirs tonight, Milly. Sit on them. Yes, dear. Tell 'em that we'd have sent them their confounded eggs long ago, if only their rotten 2-penny halfpenny incubator had worked with any approach to decency. He paused. Or would you be sarcastic, Garnet, old horse? No, better put it so that they'll understand. Say that I consider that the manufacturer of the thing ought to be in Colney Hatch, if he isn't there already, and that they are scoundrels for palming off a groggy machine of that sort on me. The ceremony of opening the morning's letters at Harrod's ought to be full of interest and excitement tomorrow, I said. This dashing counterstroke seemed to relieve Ukridge. His pessimism vanished. He seldom looked on the dark side of things for long at a time. He began now to speak hopefully of the future. He planned out ingenious improvements. Our fowls were to multiply so rapidly and consistently that within a short space of time Dorsetshire would be paved with them. Our eggs were to increase in size till they broke records and got 3-line notices in the items of interest column in the Daily Mail. Briefly, each hen was to become a happy combination of rabbit and ostrich. "There is certainly a good time coming," I said. "May it be soon. Meanwhile, what of the local tradesmen?" Ukridge relapsed once more into gloom. "They are the worst of the lot. I don't mind the London people so much. They only write, and a letter or two hurts nobody. But when it comes to butchers and bakers and grocers and fishmongers and fruiterers and what not coming up to one's house and dunning one in one's own garden, well, it's a little hard, what?" "Oh, then those fellows I found you talking to yesterday were duns? I thought they were farmers, come to hear your views on the rearing of poultry. Which were they? Little chap with black whiskers and long, thin man with beard? That was Dawlish the grocer, and Curtis the fishmonger. The others had gone before you came." It may be wondered why, before things came to such a crisis, I had not placed my balance at the bank at the disposal of the senior partner for use on behalf of the farm. The fact was that my balance was at the moment small. I have not yet, in the course of this narrative, gone into my pecuniary position, but I may state here that it was an inconvenient one. It was big with possibilities, but of ready cash there was but a meagre supply. My parents had been poor, but I had a wealthy uncle. Uncles are notoriously careless of the comfort of their nephews. Mine was no exception. He had views. He was a great believer in matrimony, as, having married 3 wives, not simultaneously, he had every right to be. He was also of opinion that the less money the young bachelor possessed, the better. The consequence was that he announced his intention of giving me a handsome allowance from the day that I married, but not an instant before. Till that glad day I would have to shift for myself. And I am bound to admit that, for an uncle, it was a remarkably sensible idea. I am also of the opinion that it is greatly to my credit, and a proof of my pure and unmercenary nature, that I did not instantly put myself up to be raffled for, or rush out into the streets and propose marriage to the first lady I met. But I was making quite enough with my pen to support myself, and, be it never so humble, there is something pleasant in a bachelor existence. Or so I had thought until very recently. I had thus no great stake in Ukridge's chicken farm. I had contributed a modest £5 to the preliminary expenses, and another 5 after the roup incident. But further I could not go with safety. When his income is dependent on the whims of editors and publishers, the prudent man keeps something up his sleeve against a sudden slump in his particular wares. I did not wish to have to make a hurried choice between matrimony and the workhouse. Having exhausted the subject of finance, or rather, when I began to feel that it was exhausting me, I took my clubs and strolled up the hill to the links to play off a match with a sportsman from the village. I had entered some days previously for a competition for a trophy, I quote the printed notice, presented by a local supporter of the game, in which, up to the present, I was getting on nicely. I had survived 2 rounds, and expected to beat my present opponent, which would bring me into the semi-final. Unless I had bad luck, I felt that I ought to get into the final and win it. As far as I could gather from watching the play of my rivals, the professor was the best of them, and I was convinced that I should have no difficulty with him. But he had the most extraordinary luck at golf, though he never admitted it. He also exercised quite an uncanny influence on his opponent. I have seen men put completely off their stroke by his good fortune. I disposed of my man without difficulty. We parted a little coldly. He had decapitated his brassy on the occasion of his striking Dorsetshire instead of his ball, and he was slow in recovering from the complex emotions which such an episode induces. In the clubhouse I met the professor, whose demeanour was a welcome contrast to that of my late opponent. The professor had just routed his opponent, and so won through to the semi-final. He was warm, but jubilant. I congratulated him and left the place. Phyllis was waiting outside. She often went round the course with him. "Good afternoon," I said. "Have you been round with the Professor?" "Yes. We must have been in front of you. Father won his match." "So he was telling me. I was very glad to hear it." "Did you win, Mr. Garnet?" "Yes, pretty easily. My opponent had bad luck all through. Bunkers seemed to have a magnetic attraction for him." "So you and Father are both in the semi-final. I hope you will play very badly." "Thank you," I said. "Yes, it does sound rude, doesn't it? But Father has set his heart on winning this year. Do you know that he has played in the final round 2 years running now?" "Really?" "Both times he was beaten by the same man." "Who was that? Mr. Derrick plays a much better game than anybody I have seen on these links." "It was nobody who is here now. It was a Colonel Jervis. He has not come to Combe Regis this year. That's why Father is hopeful." "Logically," I said, "he ought to be certain to win." "Yes, but you see, you were not playing last year, Mr. Garnet." "Oh, the Professor can make rings round me," I said. "What did you go round in today?" "We were playing match play, and only did the first dozen holes. But my average round is somewhere in the late 80s. "The best my father has ever done is 90, and that was only once. So you see, Mr. Garnet, there's going to be another tragedy this year." "You make me feel a perfect brute." "But it's more than likely, you must remember, that I shall fail miserably if I ever do play your father in the final. There are days when I play golf as badly as I play tennis. You'll hardly believe me." She smiled reminiscently. "Tom is much too good at tennis. His service is perfectly dreadful." "It's a little terrifying on first acquaintance." "But you're better at golf than at tennis, Mr. Garnet. I wish you were not." "This is a special pleading," I said. "It isn't fair to appeal to my better feelings, Miss Derrick." "I didn't know golfers had any where golf was concerned. Do you really have your off days?" "Nearly always. There are days when I slice with my driver as if it were a bread knife." "Really?" "And when I couldn't putt to hit a haystack." "Then I hope it will be on one of those days that you play Father." "I hope so too," I said. "You hope so?" "Yes." "But don't you want to win?" "I should prefer to please you." "Really? How very unselfish of you, Mr. Garnet," she replied, with a laugh. "I had no idea that such chivalry existed. I thought a golfer would sacrifice anything to win a game." "Most things." "And trample on the feelings of anybody." "Not everybody," I said. At this point the Professor joined us. End of chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Love Among the Chickens by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 15. The Arrival of Nemesis. Some people do not believe in presentiments. They attribute that curious feeling that something unpleasant is going to happen to such mundane causes as liver, or a chill, or the weather. For my own part, I think there is more in the matter than the casual observer might imagine. I awoke 3 days after my meeting with the Professor at the clubhouse, filled with a dull foreboding. Somehow I seemed to know that the day was going to turn out badly for me. It may have been liver, or a chill, but it was certainly not the weather. The morning was perfect, the most glorious of a glorious summer. There was a haze over the valley and out to sea which suggested a warm noon, when the sun should have begun the serious duties of the day. The birds were singing in the trees and breakfasting on the lawn, while Edwin, seated on one of the flower beds, watched them with the eye of a connoisseur. Occasionally, when a sparrow hopped in his direction, he would make a sudden spring, and the bird would fly away to the other side of the lawn. I had never seen Edwin catch a sparrow. I believe they looked on him as a bit of a crank, and humoured him by coming within springing distance just to keep him amused. Dashing young cock-sparrows would show off before their particular hen-sparrows, and earn a cheap reputation for dare-devilry by going within so many years of Edwin's lair and then darting away. Bob was in his favourite place on the gravel. I took him with me down to the cob to watch me bathe. "What's the matter with me today, Robert, old son?" I asked him as I dried myself. He blinked lazily, but contributed no suggestion. "It's no good looking bored," I went on, "because I'm going to talk about myself, however much it bores you. Here am I, as fit as a prize-fighter, living in the open air for I don't know how long, eating good plain food, bathing every morning, sea-bathing, mind you, and yet what's the result? I feel beastly." Bob yawned and gave a little whine. "Yes," I said, "I know I'm in love, but that can't be it, because I was in love just as much a week ago, and I felt all right then. But isn't she an angel, Bob, isn't she? And didn't you feel bucked when she patted you? Of course you did. Anybody would. But how about Tom Chase? Don't you think he's a dangerous man? He calls her by her Christian name, you know, and behaves generally as if she belonged to him. And he sees her every day, while I have to trust to meeting her at odd times. And then I generally feel such a fool I can't think of anything to talk about except golf and the weather. He probably sings duets with her after dinner, and you know what comes of duets after dinner." Here Bob, who had been trying for some time to find a decent excuse for getting away, pretended to see something of importance at the other end of the cob, and trotted off to investigate it, leaving me to finish dressing by myself. "Of course," I said to myself, "it may be merely hunger. I may be all right after breakfast. But at present I seem to be working up for a really fine fit of the blues. I feel bad." I whistled to Bob and started for home. On the beach I saw the Professor some little distance away, and waved my towel in a friendly manner. He made no reply. Of course, it was possible that he had not seen me, but for some reason his attitude struck me as ominous. As far as I could see, he was looking straight at me, and he was not a short-sighted man. I could think of no reason why he should cut me. We had met on the links on the previous morning, and he had been friendliness itself. He had called me dear boy, supplied me with a gin and ginger beer at the clubhouse, and generally behaved as if he had been David and I Jonathan. Yet in certain moods we are inclined to make mountains out of molehills, and I went on my way, puzzled and uneasy, with a distinct impression that I had received the cut direct. I felt hurt. What had I done that Providence should make things so unpleasant for me? It would be a little hard, as Ukridge would have said, if, after all my trouble, the Professor had discovered some fresh grievance against me. Perhaps Ukridge had been irritating him again. I wished he would not identify me so completely with Ukridge. I could not be expected to control the man. Then I reflected that they could hardly have met in the few hours between my parting from the Professor at the clubhouse and my meeting with him on the beach. Ukridge rarely left the farm. When he was not working among the fowls, he was lying on his back in the paddock, resting his massive mind. I came to the conclusion that after all the Professor had not seen me. "I'm an idiot, Bob," I said, as we turned in at the farm gate, and I let my imagination run away with me. Bob wagged his tail in approval of the sentiment. Breakfast was ready when I got in. There was a cold chicken on the sideboard, deviled chicken on the table, a trio of boiled eggs, and a dish of scrambled eggs. As regarded quantity, Mrs. Beale never failed us. Ukridge was sorting the letters. "Morning, Garney," he said. "One for you, Milly." "It's from Aunt Elizabeth," said Mrs. Ukridge, looking at the envelope. I had only heard casual mention of this relative hitherto, but I had built up a mental picture of her partly from remarks which Ukridge had let fall, but principally from the fact that he had named the most malignant hen in our fowl run after her. A severe lady, I imagined, with a cold eye. "Wish she'd enclose a cheque," said Ukridge. "She could spare it." "You've no idea, Garney, old man, how disgustingly and indecently rich that woman is. She lives in Kensington on an income which would do her well in Park Lane. But as a touching proposition she had proved almost negligible. She steadfastly refuses to part." "I think she would, dear, if she knew how much we needed it. But I don't like to ask her. She's so curious and says such horrid things." "She does," agreed Ukridge gloomily. He spoke as one who had had experience. "2 for you, Garney. All the rest for me. 10 of them, and all bills." He spread the envelopes out on a table and drew one at a venture. "Whiteley's," he said, "getting jumpy. Are in receipt of my favour of the 7th instant, and are at a loss to understand it. It's rummy about these blighters, but they never seem able to understand a damn thing. It's hard. You put things in words of one syllable for them, and they just goggle and wonder what it all means. They want something on account. Upon my Sam, I'm disappointed with Whiteley's. I'd been thinking in rather a kindly spirit of them, and feeling that they were a more intelligent lot than Harrod's. I'd half a mind to give Harrod's the miss in baulk and hand my whole trade over to these fellows. But not now, dash it! Whiteley's have disappointed me. From the way they write, you'd think they thought I was doing it all for fun. How can I let them have their infernal money when there isn't any? Here's one from Dorchester. Smith, the chap we got the gramophone from, wants to know when I'm going to settle up for 16 records. Sordid brute! I wanted to get on with my own correspondence, but Ukridge held me with a glittering eye. The chicken men, the dealer people, you know, want me to pay for the first lot of hens. Considering that they all died of roup, and that I was going to send them back anyhow after I'd got them to hatch out a few chickens, I call that cool. I mean to say, business is business, but that's what these fellows don't seem to understand. I can't afford to pay enormous sums for birds which die off quicker than I can get them in." "I shall never speak to Aunt Elizabeth again," said Mrs. Ukridge suddenly. She had dropped the letter she had been reading and was staring indignantly in front of her. There were 2 little red spots on her cheeks. "What's the matter, old chap?" inquired Ukridge affectionately, glancing up from his pile of bills and forgetting his own troubles in an instant. "Buck up. Aunt Elizabeth been getting on your nerves again? What's she been saying this time?" Mrs. Ukridge left the room with a sob. Ukridge sprang at the letter. "If that demon doesn't stop writing her infernal letters and upsetting Milly, I shall strangle her with my bare hands, regardless of her age and sex." He turned over the pages of the letter till he came to the passage which had caused the trouble. "Well, upon my Sam, listen to this, Garney, old horse. You tell me nothing regarding the success of this chicken farm of yours, and I confess that I find your silence ominous. You know my opinion of your husband. He is perfectly helpless in any matter requiring the exercise of a little common sense and business capability." He stared at me, amazed. "I like that. 'Pon my soul, this is really rich. I could have believed almost anything of that blighted female, but I did think she had a reasonable amount of intelligence. Why, you know that it's just in matters requiring common sense and business capability that I come out really strong." "Of course, old man," I replied dutifully, "the woman's a fool." "That's what she calls me 2 lines further on." No wonder Milly was upset. Why can't these cats leave people alone? "Oh, woman, woman," I threw in helpfully. "Always interfering. Rotten. And backbiting. Awful. I shan't stand it. I shouldn't. Look here, on the next page she calls me a gaby." "It's time you took a strong line." "And in the very next sentence refers to me as a perfect guffin." "What's a guffin, Garney, old boy?" I considered the point. "Broadly speaking, I should say one who guffs." "I believe it's actionable." "I shouldn't wonder." Ukridge rushed to the door. "Milly!" He slammed the door, and I heard him dashing upstairs. I turned to my letters. One was from Lickford, with a Cornish postmark. I glanced through it and laid it aside for a more exhaustive perusal. The other was in a strange handwriting. I looked at the signature. Patrick Derrick. This was queer. What had the professor to say to me? The next moment my heart seemed to spring to my throat. "Sir," the letter began. A pleasant, cheery opening. Then it got off the mark, so to speak, like lightning. There was no sparring for an opening, no dignified parade of set phrases leading up to the main point. It was the letter of a man who was almost too furious to write. It gave me the impression that if he had not written it, he would have been obliged to have taken some very violent form of exercise by way of relief to his soul. "You will be good enough to look on our acquaintance as closed. I have no wish to associate with persons of your stamp. If we should happen to meet, you will be good enough to treat me as a total stranger, as I shall treat you. And, if I might be allowed to give you a word of advice, I should recommend you in future, when you wish to exercise your humour, to do so in some less practical manner than by bribing boatmen to upset your friends," crossed out thickly, and acquaintances substituted. "If you require further enlightenment in this matter, the enclosed letter may be of service to you." With which he remained mine faithfully, Patrick Derrick. The enclosed letter was from one Jane Musprat. It was bright and interesting. "Dear Sir, my Harry, Mr. Hawke, says to me how it was him upsetting the boat and you, not because he is not steady in a boat, which he is no man more so in Combe Regis, but because one of the gentlemen what keeps chickens up the hill, the little one, Mr. Garnet his name is, says to him, 'Hawke, I'll give you a sovereign to upset Mr. Derrick in your boat,' and my Harry, being easily led, was took in and did. But he's sorry now, and wishes he hadn't, and says he'll never do a practical joke again for anyone, even for a banknote. Yours obediently, Jane Musprat." Oh, woman, woman. At the bottom of everything, history is full of tragedies caused by the lethal sex. Who cost Mark Antony the world? A woman. Who let Samson in so atrociously? Woman again. Why did Bill Bailey leave home? Once more, because of a woman. And here was I, Jerry Garnet, harmless, well-meaning writer of minor novels, going through the same old mill. I cursed Jane Musprat. What chance had I with Phyllis now? Could I hope to win over the professor again? I cursed Jane Musprat for the second time. My thoughts wandered to Mr. Harry Hawke. The villain! The scoundrel! What business had he to betray me? Well, I could settle with him. The man who lays a hand upon a woman, save in the way of kindness, is justly disliked by society. So the woman Musprat, culpable as she was safe from me. But what of the man Hawk? There no such consideration swayed me. I would interview the man Hawk. I would give him the most hectic 10 minutes of his career. I would say things to him the recollection of which would make him start up shrieking in his bed in the small hours of the night. I would arise and be a man and slay him. Take him grossly, full of bread, with all his crimes broad blown, as flush as May, at gaming, swearing, or about some act that had no relish of salvation in it. The demon! My life ruined, my future grey and black, my heart shattered. And why? Because of the scoundrel Hawk. Phyllis would meet me in the village, on the cob, on the links, and pass by as if I were the invisible man. And why? Because of the reptile Hawk, the worm Hawk, the dastard and varlet Hawk. I crammed my hat on and hurried out of the house towards the village. End of chapter 15.